Hey everybody, Chad, Nobody Else's Auto. More cool new inventory tonight. We've got a ton of super cool stuff coming up. You don't want to miss any of it. So click that subscribe button. 66 El Camino, Fairlane GT convertible, 70 Caprice, some great pickup truck stuff coming up, 77 Dodge four-wheel drive. We've got a lot of cool new inventory coming up, so click that subscribe button, start hanging out with us. You don't want to miss any of it. What we're going to talk about tonight are a couple of, you could almost say, forgotten or not that exciting Mopars from the 90s. Yes, Mopars from the 90s. Kind of crazy to think this stuff is literally borderline antique at this point when we're getting into the early 90s. In fact, Kansas is 35 years old, so this year, 1990, is an antique. A lot of us don't think about cars from the 90s as getting old and being collectible, but I think they may be coming. And that's one thing I do here try to pay attention to, is what is going to be the next thing. What are the cars and trucks that people may be needing parts for in the future? That's kind of what we've got here. So are these Mopars really forgettable? I don't know. You tell me. Let's talk about them real quick. First off, we're going to talk about it. We've got a 1991 Dodge Daytona. And then we've got one of the little first generation Neon coupes. So now you guys are probably wondering, have I lost my mind? Why did this stuff not just go straight to the crusher, especially the Neon? The Neon's pretty rough. Well, I've got some method to my madness here, I guess is the best way to put it. What is going to be collectible? What might people want in the future? What might they be looking for parts for? Well, all those questions, when you look at that and you go back and look at history, what cars become desirable further down the road? What do people want to restore? What do they like? Obviously stuff that reminds them of their youth. And also the other big thing are performance cars, race cars, cars that factory-backed race cars, the body styles that were used in various forms of racing, because people saw it on TV, they saw it on the track, and they can recognize that. And yes, even in the 90s, the cars that they were using for race cars still actually resembled the cars you could buy. I know in today's world that's almost unheard of in just about any form of racing. But back in the 90s, they still looked like the cars you could buy. The old win on Sunday, sell on Monday, theme still to a certain extent played out in the 90s. So even with that being said, you guys are probably still sitting there wondering, why are we looking at a Daytona and a Neon? Well, let's take a look at that. I went through some of my archives, and let's take a look at a few things here. The Dodge Daytona. Well, Dodge back then heavily involved in racing. Not NASCAR, they were not back in NASCAR yet, but various forms of racing, SCCA, drag racing, off-road. Mopar was heavily involved in motorsports. The Dodge boys, Scott Jeffrey, Darrell Alderman, Daytona cars, prior to going to the Avengers in the mid-90s, the early 90s, they were running Daytona-bodied Pro Stock cars. Not only was it Pro Stock, Mopar was also involved in Nitro. They even had Daytona-styled funny cars. So back then, even the funny cars somewhat resembled the stock cars. There again, back to racing the stuff that looked like what was on the showroom floor. Not only was it in drag racing, but another thing that a lot of people forget about is, in today's world, you mention IROC, and 99.9% of people think of a third-gen Camaro. In fact, it's gotten to the point now where a lot of people will see a third-gen Camaro. It may be an 84 Berlinetta, and people call it an IROC, because the IROC name has become so synonymous with the third-generation Camaro that they're almost one and the same. However, Chevy gave up the IROC contract, gave up or lost it, I'm not sure which, in 1990. And who picked it up? Dodge. And they ran Daytonas. The IROC Dodge Daytona in the early 90s. So yes, there was an IROC Daytona. Not only was there an IROC Daytona, there were Shelby Daytonas. If you go back into the earlier stages of this body style, back in the mid 80s, you could get a Shelby. Shelby was involved with these cars, the early 4-cylinder turbos. So these cars have a long history going back into the 80s that culminated in this performance era of the early 90s. to the point where we've got Mopar Performance News, April of 1990. There's the IROC Daytonas right there, right on the cover. And just to give you an idea of how involved Mopar was, you can tell the credit union it's an economy car on the Daytona, because they were a sporty little car. You could get these with a V6 and a 5-speed for the time. They weren't a terrible car. The concept cars that Dodge was coming out with, obviously the Viper, all this performance-based stuff. Obviously the predecessor to the LS cars that we saw, or LH cars that we saw a few years later, based on the LH platform. Mopar Performance, the finish line, NHRA, the Darrell Alderman Daytona. Nitro, Top Fuel, they were involved even with Top Fuel cars. Off-road racing. Mopar heavily involved in motorsports in this time frame, which is kind of crazy to think about. Even Tech Tips, a whole article on cam duration. Considering 10 years prior to this, Chrysler was literally broke. To be to this point 10 years later and be competitive in these series is kind of crazy. Inside the IROC Daytona. More performance parts, all the way up even to superchargers. Restoration parts, and even other stuff, IMSA, stadium racing. All this stuff that Chrysler was involved with. Even performance-based ads on the back of magazines like Automobile with the Viper on the front. Obviously the Viper synonymous with 90s Chrysler performance, which obviously we know I love Vipers. You know, I've got mine that I've had for several years. I'm a big Viper fan, but this other Chrysler stuff from this era, I still think is cool. They put a Viper on the front. They advertise heavily for the Daytona on the back, including the Daytona IROC RT. Even NHRA, National Dragster, the Darrell Alderman Daytona on the front. And even their performance catalog, the 1991 Dodge Performance Catalog, including the Daytona, the Shadow ES. They even had performance shadows and spirits, even some Shelby versions of those cars. The IROC car, the Daytona. So that's the type of stuff I think about. So now a lot of you guys are probably saying, okay, we see where you're going with the Daytona. But what about the Neon, right? It's a Neon. They were a small economy car that for the time, they did fill a niche. They were very popular. Chrysler sold a ton of them. But you're sitting here wondering, why are we talking about it and talking about Chrysler performance and motorsports in the 90s, and we got a Neon behind us? Well, there's actually a little bit to that as well. For one thing, the Neon was a very diverse car, and it was designed to be a very diverse car, even with a broad range of accessories available for the Neon. Bike racks, colored floor mats, of course, CD players, splash guards, ski racks. So once again, okay, they were trying to market them as a fun little car. What do they do in the performance world? Why would anybody care? Believe it or not, Neons were used in SCCA racing, believe it or not. Yes, we go back to some of these old Mopar expressions from the 90s. Obviously with a Viper on the cover, that's going to catch your eye. But what about Neons? Well, let's take a look in here. Neons in SCCA racing. Showroom Stock Club racing with the little Neons. So yes, Neons were actually used in SCCA racing. Not only did Chrysler use them in SCCA racing, they also used them in special events. We go to this Mopar Expressions with another article about the Neon in here. For celebrity challenge races using Neons. So anyway, am I crazy for saving these cars? Who knows? Only time will tell. But that is my reasoning for saving these cars. Because I think people that remember this type of stuff down the road are probably going to show some interest in them. So let's take a look at these. These cars are rough. They're just parts cars. But there again, a lot of these cars were never saved. When's the last time you saw a Neon coupe? The parts are not going to be out there for them. So when I had the opportunity to buy these cars, I grabbed them, added them to inventory, and they're going to be here in case somebody needs them. So let's start off with a little Daytona here. This one's a 91, and as you can tell, it's rough. It's been sitting for a long time. It's missing a few bits and pieces. But for the most part, the bulk of the interior is there, including the big massive airbag people remember from that era of Chrysler. These were a fairly sporty looking little car with the hatchback design, the spoilers they used on these cars in the early 90s. There again, these things were really attractive, and with a little V6 and a 5-speed, for the time, were they a rocket ship? Absolutely not. But were they a lot of fun for the money? They were a ton of bang for the buck with a little V6 and a 5-speed and a small light car. Full width tail light panel underneath that big spoiler. And this one was more of a base model. It did have the hubcaps. They did have various versions of aluminum wheels you could get on these cars, on like the ES models and things like that. Like I said, for the time period that these cars were sold, you got to remember in the early 90s, there wasn't much out there. You know, the LT1 was not even out yet in GM. You know, you had, so you were still tune port injected on Camaros and Corvettes and Firebirds. You know, the turbo V6 Buick was gone. The Trans Am had come out in '89 with the turbo V6 just for a one-year deal. So performance was pretty spotty in this era. So early 90s Daytona with a V6 and a 5-speed and a light car, for something you could drive every day, good fuel mileage, they weren't a bad little car. I think these doors were a very unique design, the way they almost kind of triangled further up towards the front, but came back here and then cut back in. We come up to the front, they had a big sloping nose with hideaway headlights. So there again, for the time, not a bad car. This one, just a basic little 4-cylinder, which is what a lot of these probably were, but like I said, with a little V6, these didn't run terrible for what they were. Now the Neon there again, it's a pretty rough little car. It's been pretty banged up, but it is a coupe. They made these in a 2-door and a 4-door. This one, once again, a base car. And it's rough, it's been banged up, it's been scraped down the whole other side, as a matter of fact. But I didn't even have a first generation Neon on the ground. Even with a couple thousand cars here, I didn't have one single style of this Neon here. So when this one popped up, I went ahead and grabbed it. Take a peek inside of this one, and it's there again. These were a basic economy car. Nothing fancy about them at all. But they were designed to be a very diverse vehicle that did really good as far as basic transportation, got good mileage, and that's what they were designed for. However, with a little tiny light car like this with a few minor upgrades, they were a pretty sporty little car, obviously being competitive in SCCA racing. Around the back, these had kind of a different look to them as well. Just the little taillights on each corner. This one, the Plymouth version, these were available as a Dodge or a Plymouth, and they were pretty much the exact same car other than that emblem. They were both a Neon, just one was a Plymouth, one was a Dodge. That way each dealership had them available to them. But that's pretty much the only way that they came. That was pretty much the primary difference, was the emblem. So anyway, As a lot of you guys know, I worked for Chrysler starting in the late 90s up into the early 2000s. So when I look back at these cars, I remember a lot of these cars. I remember dealing with a lot of these cars. And I look back at that time period of what Chrysler was doing. That's the other reason I like this era of Chrysler. Chrysler was doing things that no one in a big company would even think about doing at any point in time. Obviously, the Viper got built. Shortly after these cars were built, the Prowler got built. That stuff, nobody would even consider doing that in a big company. Chrysler was making things happen. They were making waves. Who would take their economy car and put it in SCCA racing? That's the type of mindset that Chrysler had at that point, and that's what I think is so cool about the 90s era of the Chrysler Corporation. Obviously, since I have some ties to that, you know, my Viper's a 99. I really like that era. The 94 to 02 Dodge pickup. All those vehicles, super important to Chrysler's success, and I think stuff that down the road, people are going to look back and remember, hey, that was actually kind of neat. So that's why these are here. I hope some of that makes sense to you. Even though I first said we're going to talk about a Neon and a Daytona, you probably thought I was losing my mind. But that's my mindset, and that's why I think these cars are probably worth saving, because I think some people are going to need some pieces off of them down the road. So anyway, there you have it. If you like these old cars and trucks, we got a couple thousand of them here on the ground at Nobody Else's Auto. And if you've got any questions about these cars or any of them, just give me a call, 620-786-4428. So we can have a short conversation about your project or what you're looking for a project, year, make, model, body style, the parts you need, all that stuff. Super important to me to know if I've got something here that can help you out with your project. If you like this stuff, be sure to check out the channel, Nobody Show. That's about all we do on here is old cars, old trucks, and memorabilia, because that's really about all I know to talk about. But we have a lot of fun with it. So click that subscribe button, click that notification button. If you don't want to miss any of our live stuff, we have a lot of fun on our lives as well. Stay tuned, a lot more cool stuff coming up, like I mentioned earlier. And hopefully this makes a little sense to you. Probably still doesn't to some of you, but in my mind, I made it make sense. So I hope it makes sense to you. Thanks for watching, everybody. Stay tuned. We got a lot more cool stuff coming up. Hope to see you soon on the next video.